7:03. I think we can start. And I'll just keep an eye on letting people in as they come. So, welcome everybody to our virtual program. I don't even know, I've lost track of how many we've had so far. So this is like maybe the 6th one that we've done so far. So it's our way of trying to bring the watershed to everyone who's stuck at home. I'm Margaret Rohde. I'm the conservation manager for Wissahickon Trails. And since some of you may be new to us, I'm just gonna tell you a little bit about us as an organization. So we are an environmental nonprofit based in Ambler, Pennsylvania, in Montgomery County. We were founded in 1957, and our whole mission since that time has been to protect land and water within the Wissahickon watershed. This map on the right-hand side shows all of our preserves within that watershed. And so the watershed is all of the land over which water flows as it makes its way to a water body. So the Wissahickon watershed is 64 square miles. The more land that we protect in the watershed, the cleaner the water will be once it reaches the Wissahickon Creek. So that has really been our goal. And since our founding in 1957, we've saved close to 1,300 acres of land from being developed in Montgomery County, which is that's a lot of acreage. And it's very vital, important habitat to a lot of species who are losing ground, as we know from natural land development and climate change and habitat fragmentation. So all of our preserves are very important for mammals and birds and insects, amphibians and reptiles. They are havens for them where their populations can continue to survive and thrive in a very developed landscape. All of our land is spread out across 12 nature preserves that all have trails that are open to the public, which we maintain for a total of 24 miles. And we very actively manage our preserves so that they are as ecologically healthy as possible, again, for those species that we're trying to protect and help their populations. And we maintain the trails because we believe that people should have access to nature. We know, especially, I think, right now at this time, we all know how important it is to be able to get out into nature and to kind of receive the healing that it gives us. So we take care of the land. We keep these places open for people to enjoy and be able to connect to nature. And if you haven't gone out to any of our preserves, it's a good time to do it. If the parking lots are crowded, just come back another time. But they are really beautiful resources for you. And even though I work there, that's still what I do on the weekend. I go to our preserves. So,
question, are you open to the public?
Yes, we are. From dawn to dusk, all of our preserves are open.
Yes.
So real quick, I'll just go over some Zoom basics for you guys. So when you joined, your microphones were automatically muted. Once we start the presentation, once I hand it over to Cindy, I'm going to ask you to mute your microphones again, just so that we can be sure we all hear her really well. You can leave your camera on if you'd like. If you turn it off, you might have a stronger internet connection. So up to you. And as we go, if you come up with any questions that you'd like Cindy to answer, there is a chat box on the bottom of your screen. So if you move your cursor down, you'll see that in the Zoom window. Oh, sorry. There we go. So you can put your questions in there. And then as we go, if there's like a good stopping point for me to try not to rudely interrupt Cindy to ask her a question, I will do so. But at the end, we'll also have time for questions and answers. And if you miss anything or you want to share this with friends after the fact, the recording will be available on our website, probably within the next couple days. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, Cindy, so you can take it away.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Um, I hope you all got to get outside and enjoy the lovely weather today. I actually went out and planted a rain garden at the Upper Dublin Township building with the Environmental Protection Advisory Board, which was interesting in social distancing and masks and all the whole work. So it was a beautiful day and we got a lot done. So now we can roll on. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about how you choose pollinator plants for your garden. Now, I'm not just going to say like plant this, plant that. I'm going to talk about the pollinators and what they like and that type of thing. It's more ecology based. So, sorry, I have to get used to this screen stuff. Okay, so you have to ask yourself when you do this, what kind of habitat do you want to create? What do you want to attract? Are you looking to maximize fruit, nut, and seed production? Maybe have a farm? Or do you want to generate food for yourself or mainly wildlife? What are your growing conditions? And what kind of maintenance are you willing to put into it? And how much space do you have? And how will you control the pests without chemicals? I got into this ecological aspect of gardening from Dan Duran, who was my ecology and entomology professor. And I worked on a project with him to make a bug zoo, as it were, which was really a native plant garden. But it was a real learning experience being there with a bunch of entomologists who they wanted to have the bugs and I wanted to have the flowers. So we had to get together and decide what would be most effective. So the first thing I want to say is that most plants are pollinated by bees. Greater than 90% of all flowering plants are pollinated by bees. And there are greater than 20,000 species of bees worldwide, and greater than 4,000 species are native to the United States, and greater than 400 are native to Pennsylvania. So that's a lot of bees. Sorry. So there's so many pollinators to choose from, not just bees. There's butterflies, moths, hummingbirds, flies, beetles, wasps, and ants. So this gives you an idea of the bees that we have in this area. There's quite a few, and some of them look like wasps and some of them look like flies, but they're all bees. There's also two major categories of bees. There are the long-tongued bees, which drink nectar from the plants that have deep throats. And then there's the short-tongued bees, which are the ones that drink nectar from the very short flowers. There's also, is there a way to get rid of who's seeing this on the side, you know? Maybe I'll just delete that. Oh, there we go. Oh, sorry, it was blocking my view. Okay, so there's solitary bees and there's social bees. And in the United States, there's only honeybees and bumblebees that are social, and they build hives. So they're the ones that tend to sting because they have to protect their hive. And generally it's the females that sting. So 50% of them don't sting. But around 75% of the bees are solitary bees, and about 75% of all bees live in the ground as solitary bees. The rest of those solitary bees form tunnels in hollow plant stalks or wood hollowed out by beetles. So this gives you an idea what their, I'll say, nests, for lack of a better word, look like in a stalk. It's like a cutaway, but I'll show you more of that in a minute. So there's also, some bees are specialists and some are generalists. About 75% of our native bees are generalists, and that means that they go to many different plants, whereas the specialists tend to focus their attention on few, maybe a family of plant or even a genus of plant. And that depends on their life cycle and what's blooming in the area. So most of the specialists have short lifespans. For example, the Andrena, they're pretty, that family is pretty much a short life cycle family. The spring beauties are pollinated by them and they're out early, and these bees, they hatch early and they're only out for about a month, and then they form their hive, not their hive, but their, I'm going to call it a nest for lack of a better word. They form that, and then they're in, you know, the larval stage or the egg stage for a year, or 11 months or so, and then they come back out again. So this gives you some examples of some of these bees. The spice bush is pollinated by this Andrena. And the other day I was gardening at my brother's house, and I was under the blueberry bushes weeding, and I saw one of these southeastern blueberry bees. And the only reason I noticed it was because it was buzzing, and I looked up to see what it was. And it's just like a little bumblebee, but it's really tiny, like it's really tiny. And then there's some other bees called oil bees. They're also specialists. Now, a lot of people mistake bees and wasps. So I want to talk about the difference between the two. Wasps generally have a smooth body with only a few hairs, maybe on the top of their head, like a crew cut. And they have a relatively narrow waist. Their antennae are long and thick, and their legs are long and slender. The bees have fatter, fuzzier bodies to collect the pollen, and they're shorter with thinner antennae, and they have thick legs with pollen collection baskets on their hind legs on the females. Now, one way you can tell the bees from the flies is that bees have 4 wings, and they're actually connected in the middle by this sort of Velcro-like attachment. So it looks like they have just 1 wing, but they really have 2 that are connected together. And then they have thick, obvious antennae, and the eyes are on the side of their heads. Whereas, and they also tend to fold their wings back when they're collecting nectar or just sitting stationary. Flies, on the other hand, have 2 wings. They have short antennae, and they have large eyes that go in front of their head, across the front of their head, like here. And both bees and flies pollinate spring beauties. also, the flies hold their wings out, whereas the bees cross theirs over. So that's kind of easy ways you can tell them apart, even if you can't see them that well, as their wings. Now, bumblebees live in the ground and they nest over the winter. And then in the spring, they come out and the female, generally the queen comes out first, and then some of the females will hatch. And then then later on, the males come out and the queen dies and leaves other queens to take over, and the mated queens seek overwintering sites, so they split up. The solitary bees, they form, I'm going to call them colonies or nests inside either wood or a stalk. Now this gives you an idea. They call them, a lot of times you hear them called mason bees or leaf cutter bees or resin bees, and that just depends on how they form that nest inside the stalk. So here you can see the leaf cutter bees. They actually cut pieces of leaf off and they roll them up, and then they lay their eggs one at a time in a little roll inside the stalk, and at the top they're sealed off. Now you can see this red bud tree. You'd know this. For some reason, they love red buds, and they look like a hole puncher came and punched, pieces off. The resin bees, they form like a resin in between their cells. They call these little packed places cells. And when they hatch, the larvae are in there, and then they pupate and they turn into the adults over this year's time. The mason bees, this is a further along process. So the mason bees are already in pupation. So when the bees lay their eggs, they turn into the larvae, and then they turn into the pupa. If these were all three at the same time, these guys are further along in the process, but they come out earlier than these guys here. And these guys come out at different times. So, but they make their bee larvae eat a mix of pollen, nectar, and saliva mixed together called bee bread. So they're not only collecting the nectar, but they're collecting the pollen, and the adult bees eat pollen. Now, bees don't see color in the same way we do. They have different receptors in their eyes, and so this gives you an idea of what we see versus a bee. And bees can't distinguish red from green. So to be attracted to a red flower, it has to have some kind of underlying alluring factor. And usually that's a fragrance, but sometimes it's a color in a range that we don't see. And one of the few red plants I know that bees will go to is the bee balm, but most red plants they don't go to. Now, there's also something called a nectar guide, which is like the airway landing strip that shows the bees, hey, come on in. This is the way into the nectar and the pollen. So one of the things you need to attract bees is simple flowers. Like, for example, this bloodroot on the bottom, The double bloodroot is really beautiful, but it's completely sterile because there's no pollen and there's no nectar to attract the bees to pollinate them. So you don't want double petal types if you want to attract bees. Also, the yellow, white, blue, and purple flowers, because like I said, the red ones don't usually attract bees. And then you need some place for them to live. So sometimes they like to be under rotting wood for cover, or in open ground for underground nesting, or in old stalks of flowers or weeds or whatever. And then they need their water in a really shallow container. And of course, you have to have consistent flowers from spring to fall. Now, somebody else likes a shallow container along with the bees, and that's great. Now, if you're designing your garden for pollinators, you want to diversify your bloom times, because even though it says spring or summer or fall, you know that that's a 3-month period. So that's a long period of time. And you want to make sure there's something blooming all the time. So you can see by this chart, which I know is hard to read, that different plants will overlap and you'll always have enough flowers blooming for all the bees to come and pollinate. Now, if you're arranging your flowers for pollination, you want to make sure that you plant en masse so that they can find them and they can also get to them easily. If you have an echinacea like on one side of your yard and then one all the way over on the other side of the yard, that's a long way for them to fly, and they're trying to use every bit of their energy to reproduce. So you need to put a bunch of them together in a patch. And plus, other pollinators see them better from high up, like butterflies and moths and things like that. So plant in 3 to 7 plants together. Now, another thing is, like I told you about the long tongue and the short tongue bees, you want to make sure that you have plants that cover all the different types of flowers for the bees. Like for example, the beard tongue or the penstemon, that takes a long tongue bee, whereas the butterfly weed, a short tongue bee can go after that. So you need to have that difference in flower size. Now, a lot of times people talk about pollinator gardens, but really one of the biggest suppliers of pollen and nectar are the trees and the shrubs. Viburnums have a lot of pollen, and moths like white flowers. So any flower that's white could be pollinated at nighttime by the moths or the daytime. And you want some that are early, like the red buds and the pussy willows, and then later on you'll have the St. John's wort in the summer and the elderberries. And then later in the summer, the sweet pepper bush will bloom. And actually people that raise honeybees always tell me that they, the basswood or the linden trees are one of their favorite trees for honey. Sorry, I went backwards. Okay, so when you talk about pollinators, butterflies, you have to talk about their life cycle. First, the butterfly lays their egg on the plant, and the larvae eat the leaves of a specific host plant. So you can't just plant any old plant and expect to get, say, a monarch, because they can only eat milkweed. And that's because plants have evolved so that they don't totally become decimated every year. They've evolved with toxins in them that kill a lot of the things that eat them. But along with that, the insects have evolved to break down the toxins. But this takes millions of years. So these ecological relationships have been set up so that only a few insects can actually eat the leaves or the flowers of the plant, so the plants can survive and the insects can survive. So once the larvae eat the leaves, they pupate. And sometimes that's in the winter time and they're wrapped up in a leaf, or they're in the leaf litter. And sometimes it's in the summer. But then the adults eat the nectar. So the larvae eat the leaves and the adults eat the nectar. So you have to have food for both. So if you want to attract butterflies and moths, which are the favorite food of birds, especially ones that are feeding their babies, you need to plant flowers for butterflies and moths. So lots of nectar sources. You want red, yellow, orange, pink, white, and purple flat-topped flowers. The ones that have the short tubes are the best. And then you need specific host plants for the larvae. You know, that's a pretty specific thing. You can look it up. If you want a specific insect, you can see what its host plant is. Sometimes it's a whole family of plants, and sometimes it's only one specific plant. So you have to look that up if you want, say, a Baltimore checker spot or something like that. So you also need to have mud puddles, because they get their liquid from the flowers, from the nectar, but they don't get any minerals that way. It's just sugar water. So they need to drink out of the little mud puddles to get their minerals. And sometimes you just see them on the ground, just, you know, trying to suck something out of that ground to get enough minerals. So make it easy for them. Put a little mud in a saucer of a pot saucer from a plant pot. That works really well. And you can put some a little bit of mud and a little bit of rocks, and then everybody can drink out of that. And of course, you want to have them in a sunny spot. Butterflies' wings need to be warmed up for them to fly. So they usually sit around a while before they start to take off, especially in the morning. So this is from Doug Tallamy's book, Bringing Nature Home. And they studied all the different butterflies and moths on different plants, different species of plants, and they found that they could find 557 species. I'm going to call them Lepidoptera. It's easier than saying butterflies and moths. So they could find 550 different Lepidoptera on different on the oaks, whereas you know, some of the other ones don't have as much. So if you really want to attract butterflies and moths, plant an oak tree or any other of these trees. These are all the Latin names, but if you look below, I say birches, maples, dogwoods, willows, viburnums, hazelnuts, blueberries. We would have thought blueberries, serviceberries, and bayberries or pines. So they all support the most moths and butterfly species. So you notice for your pollinator garden, you need the trees. Now, we all talk about not spraying, but what do you do when you get a big infestation? You have to deal with it somehow. So I'm going to talk about ways you can deal with that. So one of the ways is to manipulate your habitat. And that, what you do is you provide nectar, pollen, an alternative prey, and an alternative host to predators and parasitoids during times when prey is unavailable. And I'll explain this more in a second. And then you also have to have some kind of refuge for the arthropods during the times of heat and drought, as well as the opposite when it's cold and wet. So how do you do that? First, you have to learn about what do you want to attract. Do you want predators? Predators are non-selective. They're generalists. They'll eat anything that comes by. And their adults and larvae, both adults and the larvae, eat other insects. That's an important point. Most prefer some shade. So if you have, a shrub near your flowers that you're trying to protect, say you have aphids on your rose bush and you want them to be eaten, plant, something nearby that these guys can hang out on to get some shade. Now, here's an example of some of the different types of predators. I know you've heard of ladybugs or lady beetles. These syrphid flies, they sure look like some kind of bee, but they're not. And these wheel bugs are really great for getting Japanese beetles, so you want to sort of keep them around. And lacewings, I was cutting down a viburnum one day in my yard, and it was covered with white flies, and the lacewings were all over it. And I didn't realize it till I cut it. I was pruning it because it was too big and shading my vegetable garden. And when the leaves hit the ground, everybody was on the back of the leaves. I didn't even notice it. And then I saw the lacewings, and I was like, oh no, I just messed up their lunch. So I just left the things on the ground and let them go. But the bad thing about this is that it isn't specific, and they will eat the good bugs and the bad bugs. So, but better that than nothing. Then there's the parasitoids, and the parasitoids are really specialists and attack only one species of host, or maybe one genera of hosts. The adults drink nectar, but they lay their eggs in the host insect. That's an important point, because you need to have the nectar there for them all the time if you want them to come. The larvae eat the host, which is, let's say, a caterpillar eating your broccoli. They are the most effective means of pest control, and most of them are extremely tiny, so you won't notice them. Like this samurai wasp is only the size of your pinky fingernail. There are some really big, scary looking ones like the ichneumon wasp, but these guys these big long things that look like a stinger are really an ovipositor, and that's where they lay their eggs in their host. And the host plants actually put out a chemical when they're being attacked, And that chemical calls in the specific wasp or whatever, the fly, whatever, and it says, help me, I'm being eaten by dogwood borer, come help me. And they will go and they will lay their eggs and they will burrow through the wood into the tree where the borers are, and they'll lay their eggs in the borers. So they're very resourceful, and they look scary, but they're not. So you want to attract them. Now, food. What do you plant to attract them? Well, the predators, they eat other insects. So if you have spider mites or aphids, white flies, scale, leafhoppers, all the bad actors, these guys will just come. They just come to your garden, they find it, and they eat it. I saw that little ambush bug sitting on a phlox, and I didn't see what he was picking up, but he was there for a long time and he was really tiny, and I didn't realize what it was until I got up close to it. The parasitoids, on the other hand, they eat the eggs, the larvae, and sometimes the pupae of many insects, including aphids, flies, caterpillars, sawflies, beetles. Here's an example of a tomato hornworm being, digested, we'll say, by the larvae of the braconid wasp. And also, do you ever have scale on your trees? It's like a really hard thing to get rid of sometimes, but these guys will come and they lay their eggs right in those little holes and they get rid of it. So they're good to have around. Now, what do you plant to lure them into your garden? Well, I'm not going to go through this whole list, but you can see that there's many different things that you can plant. A lot of things in the herbs like fennel and dill, that kind of thing. And then mountain mint, rattlesnake master. They make galls. The parasitoids make galls in the leaves of the trees. So sometimes you see these balls on the ground that look like they've been made out of a leaf, and that's what it is. They take over the tissue of the plant. So these are the common flowers that you might want to plant. You see that there are a lot of the flat top flowers like zizia, yarrow, sambucus, which is an elderberry, the viburnums, and these guys too have pretty much small flat top flowers. So hummingbirds are actually pollinators for some plants, specifically the red lobelia, Lobelia cardinalis. They need a constant source of nectar, red, yellow, or orange tubular flowers, a safe place to nest with lots of shrub and tree cover, a source of live insects like fruit flies to feed their young. Now, I never really thought about it till I read this really interesting book called The Fastest Thing on Wings about how hummingbirds have to feed their babies fruit flies or something that tiny. They don't feed them ants, but they eat them, they feed them tiny little things. And I noticed the other day that I had a trillium blooming, And on that trillium, it was covered with these little insects. So we'll see if the hummingbird finds those little insects. They also pollinate like things like pawpaws, anything with a dark flower. It smells like rotten flesh. That's what the flies go to. The nesting materials they like are small grasses, twigs, and they love spider webs because their babies are so tiny. Their nests are the size of a nickel, but with spider webs there, they can stretch as the babies grow bigger. And then of course you need some kind of water. They like a mist or shallow water. My friend said he sat and watched them going back and forth in his sprinkler one day. So it's kind of a fun thing to see. Now, of course, hummingbirds are attracted to red, but they'll go to a lot of tubular flowers. But they have a sequence of native flowers that bloom from spring to fall. And when one starts and finishes, the next one picks up where that one left off. So that the Aquilegia and the Lonicera are early. They bloom around the time the hummingbirds get here. And then when they're done blooming, the Monarda pop up. And then the New Jersey tea, Ceanothus, that is a shrub, a small shrub that produces, not only does it produce nectar they like, but it attracts those little flies that the babies like to eat. So that's a good one. And then, of course, the cardinal flower is their favorite. I've seen them on white turtlehead too. So anything tubular. Beetles also pollinate many plants. They're small, so you might not have seen them, but beetles were the original pollinators before anything else, before bees even were around, and they pollinate magnolias, and they actually eat a hole through they get into between the petals before the flower opens, because once the flower opens, they drop all their stamens and there's nothing for them to get anymore. So they do it by fragrance. And I've seen them also on this goat's beard. They're very small, so they're hard to see, but they're there. And then there's the bumbleflower beetle pollinating a pawpaw. So the beetles are around and you don't think of them as pollinators, but they do pollinate specific plants. Flies eat pollen. They are not really great pollinators because they eat pollen, but it does stick to them as well. So pawpaws need some kind of fly to pollinate them because bees don't go to them. They're repelled by the aroma. And then, you have any one of these small flowers, you'll get pollination by small insects. So some of the best practices you can have for preserving your habitat for your insects are, one, to leave the leaves over the winter and don't grind them up. Many insects are either on the leaf or wrapped in the leaf or under the leaves. So if you blow them all away, then you do not have any insects the next year. This is particularly true of fireflies they have a 2-year lifespan. So it takes them 2 years to go through their life cycle. So if you get rid of all the leaves, you'll never have fireflies, unless your neighbor has them. And then be careful about pruning, because you may be pruning something like the native praying mantis egg casing off your shrub. Also, you may have something like this that you think is just a dead leaf, but inside that may be a nice moth. And then leave some wood around for wood-boring insects' nests. Beetles like to nest inside of wood, and beetles are a great predator. They eat slugs. So if you have slugs as a problem, you might want to leave some wood around, and they'll nest in there, and then they'll eat the slugs. Leave the flower stalks, like I said before. Create a bee house. Actually, you see these fancy bee houses. I had a picture of one early on where it's a whole bunch of different permutations of holes of different sizes and whatnot. That's actually not a good practice, because anything that attacks the bees will attack them all at once if they're in a hotel like that, especially something like woodpeckers or mites, that type of thing. So you want to have something that has disposable inserts in it, or just leave your stalks up. And of course, use the IPM, the integrated pest management, and attract your predators and your parasitoids. So some of the flowers that you can plant for spring, and this is just a mere, taste of what's out there. I'm sure you see it now. Actually, this Phlox divaricata is pollinated by moths because they have a big, long proboscis, and you can sometimes see hummingbird moths on those because they like the coral honeysuckle as their host plant. So they lay their eggs on the coral honeysuckle, which is blooming about the same time. And they'll go and they'll pollinate your phlox. You'll see them a lot on phlox all summer. All different kinds of phlox. And then Mertensia is a great one. The bluebells for the early bees. I see the queen bees on them a lot. And, as the summer goes along, you have the different, like the uvularia comes out a little sort of mid-season. And the sanguinaria, the bloodroot, is very early on. So you get the early pollinators. And now the zizzy is blooming now, and the geraniums are blooming now. And then later on, you get the iris and the penstemon. So you have a couple months there for your different kinds of pollinators. The sedum ternatum is also blooming now. For summer, of course, you have your purple coon flowers, your butterfly weed, your coreopsis, Stokes asters. The veronicastrum, this white flower, is a later season, blooms in like August or July, probably more like August. And it attracts so many pollinators. It's one of my favorites. Everything from skippers to little hoverflies to little bees. It's very entertaining to watch. And then, of course, if you like hummingbird moths, you'll see them at your phlox. Now, what would fall be without asters? My ecology teacher always said, And the world without asters is a disaster. So they must be pretty important. If you have shade, you can use the blue wood asters. When I went to school at Mount Cuba, one time we were walking through the woods and there were the blue wood asters. But before we saw them, we heard them. They were just covered with bees that were buzzing. And I wish I could have recorded it because it was just amazing, but it didn't come out. Things like the white turtle head is good for the bees, the late season bees, and also the hummingbirds right before they fly south. And any one of these asters are very attractive to almost any bee, many different kinds of things. And in Doug Tallamy's latest book, he talks about goldenrod being a keystone species, meaning that if there's no goldenrod, everything falls apart. So try to incorporate some goldenrod into your yard because there's so many different kinds and there's so many different uses for it. Some grow in the sun, some grow in the shade. Some are very well behaved, others are very aggressive. It just depends on how much space you have. But it's a really great plant for everybody to load up on pollen before they fly south or they go into pupation. The closed bottle gentians are really fun to watch. The bumblebees just drilling their way into them. They have to open them up to get in, and they're one of the few that actually goes through that trouble. Also, you have to have native grasses to have a full complement of pollinators. Many insects, this is their native host plant. So things like skippers, they'll lay their eggs on these and let them go over the winter. So you need to have them there to as their host plant. And I always tell people if they're planting a garden, put at least one grass in there just to get diversity. In the garden we planted today, we had prairie dropseed and tufted hairgrass and panicum. So hopefully that will attract the pollinators. Another thing you need to do is plant in layers. You want to have, the trees, the shrubs, the perennials, and the grasses, and you need different heights and different structures. So these are some of the things you might see if you plant flowers at all different times. Last year, the swallowtails were really amazing and they were all over everything. This is actually a moth caterpillar. I've seen that is a calico aster, but I've seen it on the blue stem goldenrod also, and you'll always see the butterflies and moths on the flat-topped flowers. Here's some more for different reasons. The Baltimore checker spot, its only host plant is the white turtle head. So if you'd like to see them, plant a big patch of white turtle head and you might see them. They have them at Bowman's Hill, but they're pretty rare now because nobody planted the white turtle head. They all wanted the purple one. But you can see you plant different things, you'll get different insects at different stages. This is Liatris scariosa. It's called Savannah Blazing Star, but it's a butterfly magnet. And it blooms later than Liatris spicata, and it's taller. And I would say showier, and it seems to last a long time. So it's got bees coming to it too. So I'm just going to bring this into the talk. Of course, you know, the birds and insects are tied together, and Audubon has been trying to give people information about native plants so that they can help save the birds, but in the meantime, you're also saving the pollinators. They have a website. If you look up native plants under Audubon, PA, you'll get it. And you just type in your email address and your zip code, and it will tell you a list of plants that are good for your area and what they attract. And this is what you would get. And you can put filters on it and say you want butterflies, you can use the butterfly filter. And if you want to attract a kind of bird, this was what you would, you know, look here. So it's a pretty nice resource if you have, if you want to attract birds as well as butterflies or any other pollinator, because all of them are in there. All the native plants are in there for our area. So that is it. If anybody has any questions. No.
I don't think we have anything in the chat yet.
No. Okay.
That was great. I took so many notes. That was really cool.
It's so hard to do this when you're just talking to a screen.
I know. It's hard not to be able to look at it, people.
Yeah. Oh, well. All right. Well,
That was very cool.
I hope everybody enjoyed that.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, wait, maybe we have some chats coming in. Will the chart of plants versus bloom time be available? So I have a few resources that I can email out to either everybody in here, or if anyone wants them specifically, that have like bloom times for herbaceous things, so like the low stuff, but also trees and shrubs.
So also, not all of my pictures are mine, so I can't like give them to you. You can look at them, but I can't give them to you. Okay, so you can't use them because I just use them for educational purposes. If you use them and somebody, you know, charges money for it, then it's copyright infringement. But I'm only educating you with them. A lot of them were my own pictures, though. Thank you.
You know what's interesting, Cindy, that I wanted to tell you about, because you might think it's cool. When I was out near Pittsburgh last spring, I saw Baltimore checker spot caterpillars like all over invasive honeysuckle. Yeah.
Wow. What were they on?
Honeysuckle. Like
really?
bush honeysuckle.
Bush honeysuckle? Like the bad stuff, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Like, wow, something's using it at least, and it's...
Well, you know, that's an ecological trap. So they eat it and they die. So maybe they were desperate. I don't know.
Maybe. Yeah, it was really interesting. It was cool to see them.
Yeah, they're really interesting looking.
Yeah.
They're so pretty.
So somebody asked, can you suggest local places where you can buy native plants?
Collins, Collins Nursery in Glenside,
Hmm.
Gino's Nursery in Wrightstown, Good Host Plants. Yep, that's a good one. I get a lot of things wholesale, so people can't buy them there. And unfortunately, there's no plant sales going on right now. Oh yeah, Bowman's Hill. I guess they are open with social distancing. I'm not sure what the deal is, but I know they are open.
Yeah.
Yeah, Arching's Garden. I wouldn't have thought that one. Okay.
And we have some stuff on our website too, I should mention. So if you go to Wissahickon and if you go under the Take Action banner, there's a bunch of stuff on like the places that we get plants recommendations, and it also has a link to the Audubon tool that Cindy pointed out.
Well, the problem with the spotted lanternfly is it eats the plants that our pollinators need. So it's very detrimental. Although I do know that it's poisonous to, if they eat milkweed. So they eat milkweed, they die. So plant lots of milkweed. So if they eat it, they'll suck on it. They suck on it because they're sucking insects and they die.
Wow, I did not know that.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. But yeah, they're very detrimental, and I don't know what else to say about it. It's a shame.
Yeah.
So, well.
At least some birds eat them. I've seen some birds eating them.
Oh, really?
I've heard of woodpeckers.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Good. Well, the woodpeckers seem to be proliferating this year. I've seen the pileated woodpecker in my backyard, which I never saw before.
Oh, nice.
And mating flickers. And they were like two males fighting over the female. It was really fun to watch.
That's cool.
But I have a lot of woodpeckers now. Yeah, so yeah, it's all good.
Yeah.
The birds are happy this year. I guess there must be a lot of insects out. But migration season's great. Well, I guess that does it, huh?
Yeah, if nobody has any other questions.
Okay.
And we're working on some June programming, so keep an eye out on our website for some more virtual things in June. And I hope to see a lot of you there. And if you're not a supporter of the watershed, which I'll call it the watershed forever, even though we just changed our name to Wissahickon Trails. But if you're not a supporter, I hope you'll consider becoming one, because all of the work that we do for the preserves and the trails, we can only do because we have a community of people who feel the same about protecting nature and species. So we rely on that. So thank you, everybody. I hope you all have a good rest of your Wednesday night. And I'll see you around soon, I hope.
Thank you to both of you.
You're welcome.